In 2001, archaeologists in Egypt found something that shouldn't have survived, a painted mud brick 3,700 years old, decorated with protective gods. It was a birth brick. Ancient Egyptian women literally gave birth while squatting on two of these, and the phrase "sitting on the bricks" was their actual expression for going into labor. But here's the part that should break your brain. Nobody had ever found a real one until that day. So how did ancient humans actually deliver babies? Let's go.
Here's the thing nobody talks about enough. Childbirth is the most dangerous thing most human bodies will ever do. Not war, not hunting mammoths across frozen steppes, not infection, giving birth. For most of human history, it was the leading cause of death for women. And yet, when we study ancient civilizations, we get endless documentaries about pharaohs and battles and trade routes, and exactly zero about the moment that literally created every single one of those pharaohs' subjects, the moment that created you. Because if even one of your direct ancestors had died in childbirth, you wouldn't be here. Not might not, wouldn't. The chain is that fragile. For 300,000 years, humans faced that danger without hospitals, without sterilization, without anyone who understood what was actually happening inside the body. No epidurals, no fetal monitors, no emergency C-sections when things went sideways, just gravity, pain, and whatever the people around you knew how to do. So what did they know? How did they survive it? And why did we assume they were just squatting in the dirt and hoping for the best? They weren't. And the birth brick proves it. The brick was found at Abydos by archaeologist Josef Wegner. It dates to roughly 1750 to 1700 BCE. It was discovered in the residence of a mayor's household, which means this wasn't some fringe religious practice. This was mainstream domestic infrastructure. The brick was painted with protective imagery meant to invoke divine blessings for mother and child during labor. It's the only surviving birth brick ever discovered from ancient Egypt, one out of thousands of years of civilization. Because mud brick doesn't usually survive, it's mud, it dissolves, it crumbles. You don't expect to find a 3,700-year-old brick that was specifically designed to get bodily fluids on it. And yet this one did survive, buried in a context that protected it, and it changes everything we thought we knew. Because Egyptian texts had described women giving birth squatting on two ceremonial birth bricks for decades, but no physical example had ever been found. It was like reading about ancient furniture and never finding a chair. You start to wonder if the texts are exaggerating, if the bricks are metaphorical, if maybe sitting on the bricks just meant having a hard time. Actually, it is. It's exactly as literal as it sounds. The later hieroglyphic symbol for childbirth depicts a woman on a birth stool. And Egyptian folk sayings use the expression, "he left me like a woman on the bricks," as a stand-in for extreme physical hardship. The birthing position was so universal, so embedded in daily life, that it became the word for the experience itself, not a description, the word. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting. This exact same practice shows up independently in the Hebrew Bible. Exodus 1:16 references Hebrew midwives checking a newborn's sex on the delivery stool. In Hebrew, that's literally the two stones. These are Hebrew women in Egypt being helped by midwives using the same physical object that Wegner would dig up 3,000 years later. A rare case where an archaeological artifact and a specific biblical passage independently describe the same thing. The bricks were real, the stones were real, the squatting was real. But the Egyptians didn't just use bricks, they had a god for this. In the Westcar papyrus, the god Khnum, usually known as a potter god credited with shaping humans out of clay on a potter's wheel, is depicted personally bringing in the birthing stool for a goddess in labor, linking the physical act of childbirth to the mythological idea of humans being crafted into existence. Your body isn't just giving birth, it's being the potter's wheel. The stool isn't just furniture, it's sacred infrastructure. And that tells us something crucial. Ancient humans didn't see childbirth as purely biological. It was technological. It was spiritual. It was an engineered event. They looked at the most dangerous moment in a woman's life and said, "We need equipment for this. We need ritual. We need divine protection." That is not primitive thinking. That is systems thinking.
Okay, so Egypt had bricks and stools and gods, but what about before Egypt? What about before civilization? What about the hundreds of thousands of years when there were no bricks, no stools, no midwives with specialized knowledge? What about Neanderthals? In 2009, researchers did something remarkable. They took a female Neanderthal pelvis from Tabun, Israel, 60,000 to 100,000 years old, and reconstructed it. But here's the catch. The bones were too fragile and fragmented to physically piece together. The pubis and ilium were scattered fragments. So scientists used computer modeling to virtually reassemble the pieces, mirroring undamaged bone fragments to reconstruct the missing side. This wasn't traditional archaeology. This was digital forensics. And what they found should change how you think about your own birth. The Neanderthal birth canal was roughly as tight and difficult as a modern human's. But, and this is the critical difference, the shape shows Neanderthal babies didn't need to rotate their bodies during delivery the way modern human babies do. That specific rotational birth pattern, the twisting motion your own birth almost certainly involved, is now believed to have evolved surprisingly late, likely within only the last 300,000 to 400,000 years. Let that sit for a moment. The type of birth every human is born through today may be a surprisingly recent evolutionary event, not something that stretches back millions of years. Because pelvic bones survive fossilization so poorly, tracing exactly when modern rotational childbirth evolved has been notoriously difficult. But the current evidence suggests it's a comparatively late refinement in human evolution, arriving well after upright walking, well after our ancestors already had large brains, not evolving alongside them as many assume. So, for most of human history, birth may have been mechanically different than it is today, and then it changed, and we don't know exactly when, or why, or how many mothers and babies died during the transition. The obstetric dilemma, the conflict between big brains and narrow pelvises, didn't resolve itself cleanly. It resolved itself through millions of individual births where someone figured out how to turn the baby, or the baby figured out how to turn itself, and the ones who got it right survived to pass on the genes. And your pelvis is the result. Your mother's pelvis, the pelvis that delivered you. It's a compromise between walking upright and birthing big-brained infants, and it's a surprisingly recent compromise.
But Egypt wasn't the only place that figured out bricks. Mesopotamia had its own version. Birth bricks are independently referenced in a Neo-Assyrian letter. They even show up as a personal name element in Sumerian records. The physical practice of elevating a birthing mother on bricks for a gravity-assisted squatting delivery was common across the ancient Near East, not something Egypt invented in isolation. This was regional technology, shared infrastructure for the most universal human experience. And then there are the objects that aren't bricks at all. Some of the oldest surviving birth objects in Egyptian archaeology aren't tools. They're small nude figurines lying on tiny model beds. Terracotta bed figurines, female figures shown lying on beds, sometimes with a child, alongside model beds with no figures at all. The leading interpretation is that these weren't toys or decorations. They were objects specifically used in fertility and childbirth rituals, kept in homes as a form of magical protection or a wish for successful delivery. Think about that. Before ultrasound, before prenatal vitamins, before anyone knew what a cervix was, people were creating physical objects to manage the psychological weight of childbirth, to give the mother something to focus on, to give the community a ritual to perform, to turn terror into ceremony. The bed figurine wasn't medical equipment, it was emotional equipment. And in a world without pain relief, emotional equipment mattered.
And here's the part that connects ancient Egypt to your local hospital. Egyptian pictorial evidence shows that over time, the two ceremonial bricks were gradually replaced by an actual chair with a hole cut into the seat, allowing the same gravity-assisted squatting delivery in a more supported position. A direct design lineage connecting a 3,700-year-old mud brick to the birthing chairs still used by some midwives and hospitals today. We didn't invent the birth chair in the 1970s natural childbirth movement. We reinvented it. The Egyptians got there first and probably lost it, and we found it again. Some ideas are so obvious. Gravity helps, support helps, squatting opens the pelvis, that humans keep rediscovering them across millennia. But here's what separates ancient birth technology from modern birth technology. The Egyptians didn't have the birth brick because they understood pelvic anatomy. They had it because generations of women had squatted to give birth, and someone eventually thought, what if we elevated that? The technology emerged from practice, not theory. It was empirical engineering. Try something, watch what happens, keep what works, pass it to your daughter. And that pattern, observation, iteration, transmission across generations, is how almost all ancient medicine worked. Not because they had textbooks, because they had mothers teaching daughters, midwives training apprentices, and communities that paid attention to what kept women alive. You were born through a pelvis. Maybe your mother's, maybe a surrogate's, maybe you were adopted and someone else's pelvis got you here. But the architecture that delivered you is ancient and fragile and dangerous, and somehow your ancestors survived it, every single one of them, for 300,000 years, not because birth was safe, because they were surrounded by people who wouldn't let them die alone. The Egyptian birth brick was painted with protective gods, but the real protection was the community, the person holding the mother, the person bringing water, the person who had done this before and knew what came next, the person who placed the figurine on the bed and said a prayer because doing something was better than doing nothing. We look at the brick and see archaeology. They looked at it as survival infrastructure. And maybe the most surprising lesson is this: the technology that saved the most lives wasn't the brick, it wasn't the chair, it wasn't the god painted on the side. It was the person standing next to the brick saying, "I've got you. You're not doing this alone." Because for most of human history, childbirth wasn't a medical event, it was a social event, the most dangerous social event a community ever faced. And the communities that got it right, the ones that developed the bricks, the chairs, the rituals, the knowledge, were the ones that made it through. The ones whose children survived to have children of their own. The ones whose descendants are watching this video. So, here's what I want to know. If you had to give birth tomorrow using only ancient Egyptian technology, birth bricks, a squatting position, maybe a terracotta figurine for moral support, would you trust it? Or has modern medicine ruined our tolerance for the kind of pain that used to be just Tuesday? Let me know in the comments. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.